The silver gleamed like captured starlight under Sarah's careful touch. For 3 years she had polished every piece in the Witmore estate's grand collection, her reflection multiplying endlessly in the burnished surfaces. Each spoon, each candlestick, each ornate serving tray knew the warmth of her hands better than any human ever had. Sarah Collins moved through the marble halls like a whisper, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floors. At 23 she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her dark hair was always pulled into a severe bun, her uniform pressed and spotless, her eyes downcast. She was the girl who cleaned after everyone else had gone to bed, ate her meals alone in the servants' quarters, who read borrowed books. By flashlight in her tiny attic room, the Witmore estate loomed over Vermont's fog-draped hills like a fortress from another century. Behind its iron gates, Charles Witmore lived in splendid isolation, a billionaire so reclusive that the townspeople spoke of him in whispers. Some called him a ghost. Others wondered if he existed at all. But Sarah knew he was real. She had glimpsed him in passing countless times over the years, tall and imposing, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. He never spoke to the staff directly, never acknowledged their presence. Yet somehow his wishes were always understood and obeyed. The rules were simple: never speak unless spoken to, never look directly at Mr. Witmore, never ask questions. Sarah had learned them quickly during her first week, when the head housekeeper, Mrs. Denise, had made it clear that curiosity was not welcome in the Witmore household. "You're here to work, not to wonder," Denise had said, her voice sharp as winter wind. "Keep your head down and your mouth shut, and you'll do fine." So Sarah had done exactly that. She cleaned and polished and folded laundry with mechanical precision, letting the days blur together into a comfortable rhythm of routine. She told herself she was content. She told herself she didn't need more than this steady job, this warm bed, this quiet life away from the chaos of the world outside. But sometimes, when she was alone with the silver, she caught glimpses of her own reflection and wondered who she might have been in a different life. Someone braver, perhaps. Someone who belonged in grand rooms instead of just cleaning them. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Gray clouds pressed low over the hills, and rain tapped against the tall windows as Sarah knelt in the west parlor, scrubbing the legs of the grand piano. The wood was ancient and precious, requiring gentle care, and she hummed softly to herself as she worked, a half-remembered lullaby from her childhood at the Portland orphanage. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching, didn't sense the presence behind her until a voice, deep and unmistakably authoritative, spoke her name. Sarah. Her heart stopped. She turned so quickly she nearly lost her balance, her soapy hands gripping the edge of the piano bench for support. Charles Witmore stood 3 feet away, regarding her with those penetrating dark eyes. This close, she could see the fine lines around them, the expensive cut of his charcoal suit, the way he held himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Yes, sir?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. He didn't blink, didn't look away. When he spoke, each word fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "Tomorrow evening, you will accompany me to the Witmore Foundation Gala." Sarah stared at him, certain she had misheard. The gala was the social event of the season, attended by senators and celebrities, philanthropists, and old money families, whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. She was a housemaid who owned 3 dresses, none of them suitable for anything grander than Sunday service at the village church. I don't understand, sir." But Charles Witmore was already turning away, his footsteps echoing across the marble. As he disappeared through the doorway, Sarah remained kneeling on the floor, her hands still dripping soap. Her mind reeling with questions she knew better than to ask aloud. Why her? What could he possibly want from a girl the world had forgotten? The afternoon arrived with a sealed envelope, delivered by Mrs. Denise, with the same expression she might wear when announcing a death in the family. "There's a fitting in an hour," Denise said curtly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Downtown. Boutique. Don't be late." "But I don't understand what's happening," Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly. "Why would Mr. Witmore you were chosen?" Denise interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Don't question it. Just go." The boutique sat nestled between a florist and a jewelry shop on Main Street, its windows draped in silk and displaying gowns that cost more than Sarah earned in a year. A slim man in an immaculate suit greeted her at the door, introducing himself simply as Henry, before leading her to a private fitting room lined with mirrors. He worked in silence, his measuring tape dancing around her shoulders, her waist, the length of her arms. Sarah stood perfectly still, feeling like a mannequin being prepared for display. Rolls of fabric were unfurled, colors held up to her face in the lamplight. Shoes appeared in glass cases, their heels higher than anything she had ever worn. "Midnight blue," Henry murmured to his assistant, a severe woman with silver hair pulled back in a chignon. "It will bring out her eyes." Sarah caught her reflection in the three-way mirror and barely recognized herself. Without her uniform, without her hair scraped back in its usual bun, she looked younger, more vulnerable. The dress Henry selected was unlike anything she had ever seen, let alone worn. The midnight blue fabric seemed to capture light and hold it, shimmering with an inner glow. The bodice was fitted but not restrictive, with delicate, off-the-shoulder straps and tiny silver beads sewn along the hem like scattered stars. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, running her fingers along the silk. "But I think there's been a mistake." "I'm just your Mr. Witmore's guest," Henry said. Firmly, "that's all that matters." Back at the estate, Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to her attic room with legs that felt like water. The dress hung in a garment bag on her door, seeming to glow even through the protective covering. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and tried to make sense of what was happening. In all her years at the estate, she had never exchanged more than a dozen words with Charles Witmore. She cleaned his study when he wasn't there, polished his silverware before he used it, and arranged flowers in vases he might glance at in passing. She was background music in the symphony of his life, present but unnoticed. So why now? Why her? Questions circled in her mind like birds unable to find a place to land. She thought of the Gala photographs she had seen in the society magazines she dusted in the library. Beautiful women in glittering gowns, their smiles perfect, their pedigrees impeccable. They belonged in that world of champagne and charity auctions, of old family names and newer money. Sarah had grown up in a Portland orphanage, where hope came in the form of donated books and charity. Christmas gifts. Her favorite had been a worn copy of The Little Prince, its pages soft from countless readings. She still kept it in her nightstand drawer, still whispered its most beautiful passages to herself when sleep wouldn't come. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly," she murmured now, the familiar words offering little comfort. What is essential is invisible to the eye. But tomorrow night, she would be anything but invisible. She would be on Charles Witmore's arm, in a room, full of people who would look at her and wonder who she was, where she came from, whether she belonged. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. She pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and stared down at the scattered lights of the village below. Somewhere down there, people were living ordinary lives, eating ordinary dinners, watching ordinary television shows. She envied them their predictability, their safety in the shadows, because tomorrow night everything would change. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Whatever Charles Witmore wanted from her, whatever role she was meant to play, there would be no going back to the comfortable invisibility she had worn like armor for so many years. The wind picked up, rattling her window, and Sarah pulled her thin blanket closer around her shoulders. In less than 24 hours, a girl who had spent her whole life being overlooked would step into a spotlight. She wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear, but she had no choice. When Charles Witmore gave an order, it was obeyed. And tomorrow night, she would discover exactly what that meant. The day of the gala dawned gray and restless, with clouds gathering like an audience waiting for a performance to begin. Sarah awoke before her alarm, her body refusing to sleep despite her exhaustion. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. At precisely 5 in the evening, 2 soft knocks sounded at her door. Sarah opened it to find a woman she had never seen before, dressed in elegant black and holding a leather case that looked expensive enough to feed a small village. "I'm Celia," the woman said with a warm smile. "Mr. Witmore sent me to help you prepare." Celia moved through the tiny room like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. She worked in comfortable silence, first releasing Sarah's hair from its perpetual bun and running her fingers through the dark waves until they fell softly around her shoulders. Then came the makeup, applied with an artist's precision. Not the heavy, mask-like coverage Sarah had expected, but subtle touches that seemed to bring out features she didn't know she possessed. "You have beautiful bone structure," Celia murmured, brushing a hint of color across Sarah's cheekbones. "Classic. Timeless." Sarah watched herself transform in the small mirror above her dresser. The girl staring back at her looked like a distant cousin of the one who had scrubbed floors that morning. Still her, but somehow more. As if layers of dust had been carefully brushed away to reveal something that had been there all along. Finally, Celia retrieved the midnight blue gown from its garment bag. The fabric whispered as it settled over Sarah's head, the silk lining cool against her skin. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her body, hugging her curves without restricting her movement. "This isn't me," Sarah said quietly, staring at her reflection in wonder. "It is tonight," Celia replied, fastening a delicate silver necklace around Sarah's throat. "Trust me." At 6 o'clock, Gregory, the head butler, who had never acknowledged her existence in 3 years of service, appeared at her door. For the first time in their acquaintance, he bowed. "Miss Collins," he said formally, "Mr. Witmore is waiting." Sarah followed him through corridors she had cleaned countless times, but never walked as a guest. Her heels clicked against the marble, in an unfamiliar rhythm, the sound echoing off the high ceilings like a countdown to something inevitable. The front doors of the mansion opened onto a scene from a fairy tale. A black car waited at the bottom of the marble steps, its engine purring softly in the evening air. The driver, dressed in crisp livery, held the door open with ceremonial precision. Inside, Charles Witmore sat waiting. He wore a charcoal gray suit that must have cost more than most people's cars, his silver cufflinks catching the last rays of daylight. When Sarah slid onto the leather seat beside him, he turned to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You look lovely," he said simply, and something in her chest fluttered like a bird testing its wings. The drive to the city took 45 minutes, winding down through the hills as darkness settled over the landscape. Sarah watched the lights of small towns flicker past the window, each one representing lives she would never know, stories she would never hear. Charles sat in comfortable silence beside her, occasionally checking his phone or gazing out at the night. "May I ask you something?" Sarah finally ventured, her voice barely audible above the car's gentle hum. He turned to her, one eyebrow slightly raised, of course. "Why me?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. The car rounded a curve, and the city lights spread out before them like a carpet of stars fallen to earth. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Do you know what I see when I look at most of the people who will be at tonight's gala?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "Masks," he said. "Beautiful, expensive, carefully crafted masks. They've worn them so long they've forgotten what lies underneath." He paused, his gaze resting on her face. "You, Sarah Collins, don't know how to wear a mask. In a room full of people pretending to be someone else, you're the only one who's genuine." The car pulled up to the Grand Meridian Hotel, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The building rose before them like a palace, its facade glittering with lights and draped in banners, announcing the Witmore Foundation Gala. Red carpet stretched from the street to the entrance, lined with photographers and onlookers hoping to catch a glimpse of the city's elite. "I don't think I can do this," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. Charles reached over and covered her hand with his touch warm and steady. "Yes, you can," he said quietly. "Trust me." The car door opened, and suddenly the night air rushed in, bringing with it the sounds of camera clicks and excited voices. Charles stepped out first, then turned to offer Sarah his hand. She took it, her fingers intertwining with his, and stepped onto the red carpet. The cameras turned toward them like sunflowers following the sun, The ballroom took Sarah's breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across walls draped in midnight silk. Hundreds of guests moved like elegant swans across the polished marble floor. The women wore gowns that could have been borrowed from museum collections, their jewelry catching the light with every gesture. The men stood in perfect clusters, their tuxedos immaculate, their conversations punctuated by confident laughter. Sarah felt every eye in the room turned toward them as Charles led her down the grand staircase. Whispers followed in their wake like the rustle of silk against stone. She recognized some of the faces from the society pages she had dusted in the library. Senator Morrison's wife, with her legendary pearl collection. The tech mogul David Chen, whose donation had built the new children's hospital wing. Old money and new power, all gathered under one glittering roof. Who is she? Sarah heard someone murmur as they passed. I've never seen her before, came another voice. How did she manage to catch Charles Witmore? Charles seemed oblivious to the speculation, guiding Sarah through the crowd with practiced ease. He introduced her simply as my guest, Sarah, never elaborating, never explaining. Some people smiled politely and moved on. Others lingered, their curiosity clearly piqued by the mystery. Charles. A woman approached them, her silver hair swept into an elaborate updo and her smile sharp enough to cut glass. How wonderful to see you. And who is this enchanting creature? Victoria. Charles nodded coolly. Sarah, may I present Victoria Ashworth. Victoria Sarah Collins. Victoria's eyes swept over Sarah's dress, her jewelry, her posture, cataloging and calculating with the precision of a jeweler appraising a diamond. Collins, she repeated thoughtfully, don't believe I know the family. No, Sarah said quietly. I don't suppose you would. Something flickered in Victoria's expression, a moment of confusion at Sarah's honesty. Most people in this room would have invented a pedigree on the spot, claimed distant connections to old families or European nobility. Sarah's simple truth seemed to wrong-foot her entirely. How? Refreshing, Victoria said after a pause, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. Well, I hope you enjoy your evening. As Victoria glided away, Charles leaned close to Sarah's ear. You handled that perfectly, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. I don't know how to be anyone else, Sarah admitted. That's exactly why you're here. The evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Charles introduced Sarah to donors and dignitaries, artists and activists. Some were genuinely kind, asking about her interests and listening to her answers. Others were clearly puzzled by her presence, their confusion evident in the way they exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking. But as the night progressed, something unexpected began to happen. People started seeking her out, drawn by her quiet authenticity in a room full of performance. A young senator's wife confided her struggles with loneliness despite her public success. An elderly philanthropist shared stories of his childhood poverty, admitting he rarely spoke of his humble origins anymore. There's something about you, the philanthropist said, patting Sarah's hand gently. Listen with your whole heart. That's a rare gift. During dinner, Sarah found herself seated between a federal judge and a museum director, both of whom seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on the foundation's work with underprivileged children. She spoke about her own experience in foster care, her voice growing stronger as she realized these powerful people were actually listening to her words. It's not just waiting for their turn to talk. We need more voices like yours in our discussions, the judge said thoughtfully. Too often we make decisions about problems we've never actually lived. When the dancing began, Charles led Sarah onto the floor with a confidence that surprised her. She had never learned to waltz, but somehow her body followed his lead instinctively, as if they had been dancing together for years instead of hours. You're a natural, he said, as they moved through the other couples, her midnight blue dress flowing around them like water. I'm terrified, she admitted, though she was smiling. Good, he said. That means you're alive. As they danced, Sarah caught glimpses of their reflection in the mirrors that lined the ballroom walls. The couple she saw looked like they belonged together, like they had stepped out of a fairy tale. But she knew the truth. At midnight, the ball would end, and she would return to her attic room, her uniform her invisible life. "Shh," said softly. "What happens tomorrow?" He spun her gently, bringing her back into his arms. "Tomorrow," he said, his eyes holding hers, "we decide who you really want to be." The music swelled around them, and Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would never be the same invisible girl who had knelt on the parlor floor just 2 days ago. The woman in the midnight blue dress was real. She had been hiding inside Sarah all along, waiting for someone to see her, to call her forward, to give her permission to exist. But as the final notes of the waltz faded away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The ride back to the estate passed in thoughtful silence, the city lights gradually giving way to the darker countryside. Sarah sat beside Charles, her midnight blue dress pooled around her like captured starlight, her mind still processing the extraordinary evening. She had spoken with senators and socialites, danced under crystal chandeliers, and felt for the first time in her life like she truly mattered. As the car wound up the familiar hill toward the mansion, Charles finally spoke. "Sarah, I owe you an explanation." She turned to face him, noting the way the passing streetlights cast shadows across his features. "You don't owe me anything, sir." "Charles," he corrected gently. "And yes, I do." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with a condition that will eventually take my sight. The doctors give me perhaps a year before the darkness becomes complete." Sarah's breath caught. "So sorry." "Don't be sorry yet," he said with a slight smile. "Let me finish." The car turned through the estate's iron gates. "I've spent the last decade building walls around myself, convinced that isolation was strength. But facing blindness has made me realize something important. When the world goes dark, the only thing that matters is the people who choose to stay." The car came to a stop at the marble steps, but neither of them moved to get out. "I've been watching you for months," Charles continued. "Not in a way that should frighten you, but in the way someone notices genuine kindness in a world full of pretense. You help Mrs. Denise with her arthritis when you think no one is looking. You leave books outside Gregory's door because you know he loves to read, but is too proud to ask. You water the plants in the servants' hall because you can't bear to watch anything beautiful wither away." Sarah stared at him in amazement. She had thought herself invisible, but he had been seeing her all along. "Tonight wasn't about the gala," Charles said quietly. "It was about showing you who you could be if you chose to step into the light. But more than that, it was about asking if you might consider stepping into my life. I don't understand." Took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "I'm offering you a choice, Sarah. You can return to your room tonight and tomorrow morning. Put your uniform back on and pretend this never happened. Or you can stay. Not as my employee, but as my partner. Help me navigate the coming darkness and let me help you discover the light you've been hiding." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "But I'm nobody special. I'm just a girl from an orphanage who knows how to polish silver. You're the girl who quoted The Little Prince to herself in the dark and never stopped believing in beauty," Charles said softly. "You're the girl who treated everyone with kindness even when the world was unkind to you. You're the girl who walked into a room full of strangers tonight and reminded them what it means to be genuine." He paused. "You're the girl I've been waiting my whole life to find." The driver cleared his throat politely, and Charles smiled. "We should go inside. You need time to think." They walked up the marble steps together, no longer master and servant, but simply two people who had found something unexpected in each other. At the door, Charles turned to her once more. "Whatever you decide, Sarah, thank you. Tonight you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that?" "Hope." Sarah spent the next hour alone in her attic room, still wearing the midnight blue dress, still feeling like someone caught between two worlds. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror and saw not the invisible maid she had been, but the confident woman she had discovered herself to be. At dawn, she made her choice. She found Charles in his study, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and the morning paper. When she entered, he looked up with an expression of carefully contained hope. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "About choosing who I want to be." Charles set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. For 23 years, I've been afraid of taking up too much space, of asking for too much, of believing I deserved more than the scraps the world offered me, she continued. But last night, you showed me something different. You showed me that I don't have to apologize for existing. She moved closer to him, her decision crystallizing with each word. I choose you, Charles. I choose us. I choose to step into the light. Charles rose from his chair and crossed to her, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. Are you certain? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were. Sarah smiled, and for the first time in her life, it reached all the way to her eyes. I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. With you. When he kissed her, it tasted like sunrise and possibility, like all the tomorrows she had never dared to dream about. Outside the window, the morning light spilled across the gardens, chasing away the shadows and illuminating a world full of hope. 3 months later, Sarah Collins became Sarah Witmore in a small ceremony in the estate's garden, surrounded by flowers she had once tended as a servant and now treasured as the lady of the house. She established a foundation for orphan children, using her own story to bring hope to those who felt forgotten by the world. And when Charles's sight finally began to fade, she was there beside him, describing the sunset over the hills, reading to him from books they chose together, and proving every day that love sees with the heart, not the eyes. They had found each other in the shadows and chosen to create their own light. And in that light, they built a life more beautiful than any fairy tale. Asterisk, the end asterisk. Asterisk, like this video if the story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional tales, and share with someone who believes in the power of true love. And let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.